Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we will explore Entity Manager lifecycle methods. So we will cover methods like persist, find, refresh, detach, and merge. Why is it called Entity Manager lifecycle methods? Because these methods are called on the instance of Entity Manager. In JPA, Entity Manager is an interface which we use to interact with the persistence context and to call different methods for different entities. And as a result of those method calls, the corresponding database operations will be executed for those entities. But before everything, let's first understand what is the persistence context. Persistence context is a core concept in JPA which is used to manage the life cycle and states of different entities. We can consider this context as a simple cache or even as a simple hash map. So let's take an example to better understand the persistence context. Let's say we have an application. This is a Java application. So when we start this Java application, it will start a new instance of a JVM. So this is a JVM instance. That means it has a heap memory attached to this process. This is a Java application. Now in a Java application, we create many objects. As we go on with the processing and the functionality, the application creates many objects, many instances. In the same way, when we are using the JPA and Hibernate in an application, it will create a new instance of the persistence context on the heap. So let's say this is the persistence context which is running within the boundary of the JVM of that particular application, and it is an object same as any other object. The thing is, this persistence context works with the database. So when we use JPA and Hibernate, the ultimate goal is to translate those entities and the corresponding operations into database calls so that we can perform operations like CRUD on those entities. So this persistence context is working with the database. So when we define an entity, when we are working with any entity, the entity first goes into the persistence context and then Hibernate decides what to do with that entity. So for example, we are persisting an entity. Now the thing is, it will not be persisted directly immediately. It might happen that the entity will go into the persistence context and at an appropriate time, Hibernate will trigger the insert query so the entity will be inserted in the database. So it might happen late, but the important thing is the entity will always go to the persistence context. Let's say we have an user entity and we want to save this user entity. So what we will do, we will create a user object, we will set the required properties, and then we will call the, let's say, persist method of the entity manager to persist this entity. Now, what would happen when we create a new user object? The thing is, this entity object is not in the persistence context as of now. So when we call an appropriate method of entity manager, this particular object of the entity will be added to the persistence context. So first it goes here in the persistence context. And then depending on how we commit the transaction at an appropriate time, Hibernate will see that we want to persist the entity. So this entity will be persisted in the database when Hibernate triggers or executes the insert query. And the same thing happens with other operations like update and delete. So the entity will be added to the persistence cache or persistence context, and then Hibernate will execute appropriate queries to sync this entity with the database because this entity represents a particular table in the database. All right. Now Hibernate always tries to keep both the entities in sync. It does its best to keep the entity, which is here in the persistence context, and the data that is in the corresponding table in sync. And to do that, it uses the persistence context. So that is the role of persistence context. Now, how do we interact with this persistence context? How do we manipulate this persistence context? So the thing is, this is done by the instance of something called entity manager. So anytime we are interacting with the persistence context, either directly or indirectly, we need a new object of entity manager. You can also call it a session in Hibernate terms. So for each operation, you will typically create a new entity manager object. You will do the job and then the object of that entity manager will be disposed. And how do we get this entity manager object? We get it from the Entity Manager Factory. In JPA terms, these are called Entity Manager Factory and Entity Manager, but in Hibernate terms, these are called Session Factory and Session. So what happens? The Entity Manager Factory is instantiated when the application is coming up and it is establishing the connection with the corresponding database. So we don't need to create a new object of Entity Manager Factory every time. This is a costly object. But once we have the object of Entity Manager Factory present in the, let's say, Spring context, application context, for each operation, we create a new object of Entity Manager. So first we get the Entity Manager Factory. Then from the Entity Manager Factory, we get the new instance of Entity Manager. And then we call the appropriate methods to interact with the persistence context. So that is how it generally works on a very high level. Let's move on and cover the lifecycle methods. So the first method that we will cover is the persist. The persist method of Entity Manager is used to persist the entities, to store the entities in the database. So suppose we have the same application boundary, and in the application boundary we have the persistence context, and here we have the database. And suppose we have a user entity and we want to create or insert a new record for the user entity. So in the application, what we will do, we will create a new object of user entity. Then we call the persist method of Entity Manager and we pass this entity to this method. Now what this method will do, this method will add this entity to the persistence context. All right. And when we commit the transaction, Hibernate will trigger an insert query to store this data in the corresponding table. So persist method adds the entity to the persistence context, and then Hibernate will trigger an insert query at an appropriate time that will ultimately insert the record in the database. So that is how an insert works using persist method. Update follows the same cycle. There is no specific method to update the entity. What happens in this case? Let's say we have the same user entity which was inserted in the database. So this was an insert using persist method. Now we made some changes in the same user entity. Maybe we updated the name attribute. So here is another instance with some updated values. Now we call the same persist method on this entity as well. And within the scope of a particular session, we will cover this when we cover the demo. When we call the persist method using the same entity, it will again be added to the persistence context. But this time Hibernate will see that it has the same entity available in the persistence context. As you remember, I said that you can consider it as a cache or even as a map. And in this map, you can consider the entity is the key, or maybe the ID attribute is the key. It doesn't matter, but the thing is, in this persistence context, only one particular instance of an entity will reside. And when I say only one particular instance, it doesn't mean a single instance of user. It just means a single instance of user with a particular primary key or the object equality criteria. So it might happen that there could be n number of user objects in the persistence cache, but for the same object equality criteria, let's say the ID, there will always be one user entity for a particular ID in the context. So this time Hibernate will see that we have a matching entity already available in the persistence context. So it will do the dirty checking. Hibernate will do it automatically. It will see that these two objects have some different values. So what it will do, it will sync the user entity in the persistence context. And now there are some changes. It can apply the dirty checking. It can see that the data which is here in the persistence cache or persistence context is different from what is there in the database table. And it also knows that there is a record in the database already for this user entity. So what it will do when we commit the transaction, it will trigger an update query that will sync the entity which is here in the persistence context with the record which is there in the database. So that is how we perform the insert and update using Entity Manager's persist method. We will now cover the find method of the Entity Manager. So in the same way as we use persist, we use the find method on the Entity Manager, but this time we pass it the primary key of the entity. And what we get in return is the object of that entity. So Here we have the same application boundary, and there we have the persistence context. Now here on the Java side, when we call the code em.find by passing it a key, what Hibernate will do first, it will go to the persistence context. It will check whether the entity already exists in the persistence context or not for this particular primary key that we passed to the find method. If it does, it will return the same entity to the calling application or to the calling code. If not, it will trigger a select query. It will fetch the record from the database, add it to the persistence context, and then return the same entity back to the calling code. Now, it could happen that the entity is already in the persistence context. So while the entity is in the persistence context, if we call the find method again by passing the same key, Hibernate will again check the persistence context first, and this time it will find the entity in the context. So in this case, it will not trigger a select query. It will simply return the object or the entity back to the calling code. So that's how find works. Next, we will cover the refresh method. So in the same way, we call the refresh method on the entity manager object. Now, what does it do? So suppose here we have the application running and we have the persistence context, and here we have the database. Suppose we wanted to store a new user entity. So for that, we created a new object of user entity, and let's say it has only two fields. The first one is title and the second one is primary key, or maybe just three fields, let's say. So this is the primary key, this is the title, and this is the address. This is our user entity. So what we did, we called the persist method on this entity that will basically add the object to the context, and here we have the context. All right. So the context also has the same values for this user entity. And when we committed the transaction for this operation, Hibernate inserted this record into the database. So here in the database table, we also have the same record with values 1, title T, and address A. All right. So the application moved on, and consider we passed this entity to some other method, which may be passed it to some other methods. And in this particular example, we have only three attributes, but in real life, maybe this entity has many attributes. And at this point of time, we don't know exactly what attributes have been changed by these method calls. So we know that the primary key is 1, but we don't know what is the title exactly at this point. And similarly, we don't know the updated value of the address at this point. And it is also possible that between this time T1 to T2, someone changed or updated the record in the database. So maybe instead of 1TA, this is now 1T-A. So the title has been changed by some other operation. And also at this point here in the application code, we don't know the updated values of title and address. So in some scenarios, when we are unsure the current state of the entity, we want to reset the entity to a good known state, the state which is based on the data that is available in the table. So maybe we want to reset everything that was done here, and we want to start fresh based on some good known state, and that good known state is now this particular state where the title has been changed. So when we call the refresh method of the entity manager, what it will do, it will simply discard everything, all these operations, all these manipulations, and it will read the data from the database and reset the entity in the persistence context like this. So it simply refreshes the entity from the database. All right. Instead of updating the database, here we are doing the reverse. The entity is being updated from the database. So that is the function of refresh method. And once we reset the entity to a good known state, we can continue or resume the work. Okay, now we will cover another method which is called merge. Merge is simply reverse of the refresh. So we will cover the merge method using the same scenario. But before that, let me clean up the diagram a little bit. All right. So in this case, we had the same user entity that we created on the Java side. Then we persisted the entity. So the entity was added to the context. And then when we committed the transaction, Hibernate inserted the record to the database. And in the database, we have this particular record 1, T, and A. Then what we did, similar to the previous use case, we passed this entity to all these methods and this entity was updated. It was modified. So let's see the title got modified to T2 and address to A2. So in the persistence context, we still have the old values, which are 1, T and A. And in the database also, we have 1, T and A. But here the entity has been changed. So in the refresh method, what it was doing, it was refreshing or resetting the entity from the database. It was refresh method. But in the merge method, what if we want to update the entity with the new changes? So when we call the merge method, what Hibernate will do, it will merge this entity to the one which is there in the persistence context. So this is merge method. And when Hibernate does the merge, it will see some values have been changed. So what it will do, it will simply update the updated attributes like this. So now the title is T2 and address is A2. So the entities or the values have been merged now, and when we commit the transaction, Hibernate will do the dirty checking and it will see that these two attributes have changed. So an update query will be triggered. And it will update the record in the database as well, which is 1, T2 and A2. So that is the role of merge method. In the merge method, we merge the changes outside of the persistence context with the persistence context. And then these changes will be synced to the database. But in case of refresh, what we did, we reset the entity from the database in the persistence context. So I hope the distinction is clear between refresh and merge. So let's cover the last method, detach. What happens, we have the same application and we have the persistence context, we have the database. So after that, what happened, we created a new object of, let's say, user entity. Now this user entity is basically a new record which is not in the database and it is also not in the persistence context at this stage. Such objects or such entity objects are called transient. Means Hibernate doesn't know anything about this entity as of now. It's not tracking the changes done on this entity. But when we call one of the persist methods, and as a result of those method calls, this entity will be added to the persistence context as we have seen before. So when the object is available in the persistence context, then we call such entity objects as managed objects. Because now Hibernate knows the existence of these objects, Hibernate is tracking the changes done on these objects. So when we commit the transaction, Hibernate will trigger the appropriate queries. And that is happening because these objects are managed objects managed by JPA Hibernate. So suppose as a result of persist, this method got inserted in the database by Hibernate. Now the thing is, when we have the managed entity, any change that we do on the managed entity is basically being tracked by Hibernate. So maybe we don't want to do that in some scenarios. So here's the use case. We have a managed entity, but after a certain point of time, we want to make some changes, but we don't want Hibernate to track those changes. But since the entity is a managed entity, Hibernate will track the changes. So what we can do is we can detach the entity. By calling the detach method of the entity manager on a certain entity, we are detaching the entity from the persistence context. So that means this entity is not managed anymore by Hibernate. So here we are again on the Java side, this entity is now in the detached mode. That means Hibernate is not tracking this entity anymore. This is not in the persistence context. Maybe it is removed from the persistence context. We don't know the details, but Hibernate is not tracking the entity anymore. So let's say we made some changes and the new state of the same entity on the Java side is something like this. All right. But the good thing is Hibernate is not tracking these changes because we have detached the entity. Now this is one use case. This use case is that we simply detach the entity and then we update the entity as we wish without being tracked by Hibernate. The second case could be that we made some changes, but now we want to persist or update the record. So how do we do that? In that case, at this point of time, we will now call the merge method. And we have already covered the merge method. What it will do, it will simply merge this entity and the one which is there in the persistence context. It will simply update the attributes which have been changed. And then when we commit the transaction, the query will be triggered and the update will happen in the database as well. So in a nutshell, what detach does, detach simply detaches the entity from the persistence context and it removes the managed status or managed state of that entity. So any change that is being done on the entity is not tracked by Hibernate. But later we can track the changes by calling the merge, which will simply merge the entity outside the persistence context with the one which is available in the persistence context. So till now we have covered 5 methods: persist, find, refresh, merge, and detach. And the important thing that we need to understand is all these things are happening on the persistence context first.